All right, you guys, now we're going to go into a totally different direction here for a while. I want to teach you something about what you do in your code when you have a block of code that you need to repeat. When you need to repeat something over and over again, or you need to do something until the network is up, or you need to do something until all the Bluetooth devices are found, something like that, you need to use what C# calls loops. And all programming languages have loops. They just have different kinds and they just use them in different ways. Now what you see on the screen is a program I have on your website, on your C# page, called the Loop Test Demo, and I would strongly suggest that you download it and you run it so that you can see how this works. And what I tried to do was I wanted to show you the different kind of loops, most of them. There's one that's not on here, but I'll show you in a different video. I wanted to show you how these loops work and what the result is, and then we'll look at a program where you actually can use it. On the left side, you'll see this right here is a list box, and I'm printing out the result of my code so that you can just see the output. There are three basic kinds of loops, in my opinion. There are counted loops, there are logic loops, and there are collection loops. So in your notes, under counted loops, I want you to put next to it for loop, a for loop. In the logic loops, I want you to put while loop and do loops. Those are examples of logic loops, and those would be like do something until a certain condition is met. Tell the robot to keep running around the room until it gets within a foot of the wall and then turn around. That's a logical loop. A counted loop would be like saying, I want the robot wheels to turn 25 times and then stop. So when you know how many times you want something to go, or you need to use it or repeat it, then you're going to use a counted loop, and that's almost always a for loop. The logic loop is a while loop or a do loop. Those are two variations. And then the third one is a for each loop. That's part of what I call a collection loop. It's very, very powerful, very, very cool. And we'll look at that in other videos in this series. Let me explain something here with the counted loop. We're going to do that first. One of the things you have to do is you have to set up your loop and tell the computer how many times you want it to repeat a particular activity. Now in this case, you look over here, all I'm doing in this line right here, I'm just taking the value of something and I'm sticking it in this list box over here, and you can see it's going to do it 5 times. This is an example of using a for loop to do something 5 times. And it's very, very, very simple. And all I'm doing is taking the value of x in this case and putting it in the list box so you can see how it works. But you have to remember a couple things. First of all, you have to keep track of how many times your loop is actually running. And again, you have to tell it how many times you want it to go. Well, in order to do that, we need a little variable to keep track of how many times we're repeating our code. Now, keep in mind, I only have one miserable line in here, but you might have 50 lines inside this loop, or 5 lines, and you just want the computer to, hey, do this, then do this, and do this, and do that 15 times, and then do something else. That's what this is for. So up here in the top, when you set up your for loop, it sets up very similar to an if statement in the sense that you type in the word for, and remember, we're just counting, and then in parentheses, and no semicolon at the end of this line, you guys, you're going to tell it 3 things. In order to keep track of how many times a loop runs, we have to have something called a loop control variable. I want you to know that that's what it's called. And you can see that I created one in here as a short integer. I very easily could have just typed in int, but for some reason I wanted to show you that you have other options. So this is a short integer. That means it's a 16-bit integer. It can count anywhere from minus 32,000 up to about plus 32,000. More than enough from what I need. So the very first thing is you declare a new variable. We say it's a short, it's x, and I'm going to initialize it to 1 because I want to count from 1 to 5. And then you put in a semicolon. It's a little hard to see on the screen, but that's a semicolon. And then you have to say to the computer, well, how many times you want this puppy to run? I want it to run as long as x stays less than 6. So I want it to count from 1 to 5. So when x equals 6, I want it to stop. Remember, this is a counter. This x is going to be a counter, and we're going to just keep adding 1 to it. And when it gets to 6, we're going to stop. Now after you do x is less than 6, you do a semicolon, and you see the third thing is Well, how are we going to count this loop? Are we counting by ones, by twos? Are we counting backwards? What are we doing? Well, the x++ simply says take the value of x and add 1 to it. That's how we're going to count. So now the computer knows, okay, we're just counting by ones. So when this first line runs that I have highlighted for you, it's going to come in here and set up our loop. The very first time it runs, x is going to be equal to 1 because that's what I initialized it to. The computer says, well, I'm going to keep doing this as long as x is less than 6. Well, it knows x is 1, so therefore that's okay. I'm going to run my loop. And so it's going to come in here and it's going to do what I tell it. Well, all I told it to do was take the value of x, which is 1, and add it to the items collection of the list box, and that's why you see a 1 over here on the left side in the box. Now, it doesn't say so, but when the computer comes down here to this curly brace, it's going to go back up here and see if it's supposed to do it again. So when it comes down here, what it really does is it increments x, so it adds 1 to x. So now x is equal to 2. It doesn't show that, it doesn't see that, but that's how it behaves. Now x is 2, so it comes back up here to the beginning of the loop and it says, okay, x is 2, should I keep going? Well, this thing in the middle says keep going until x, as long as x is less than 6. I said, okay, I'm going to do it again. So it comes down here and it runs this line. Now x is 2, so it adds the value 2 to the list box. That's why the 2 is over there. Okay? It does it again for 3, 4, and then 5. So here we have 5 in there. Now what happens when x is 5? It comes down here and it increments it. Now x is 6. It comes back up here and it says, okay, should I keep going or not? And this says, no, you can't keep going because we want it to go until x is less than 6. So then it says, well, I'm not going to go anymore, and it doesn't print out anymore. It comes down here, and then if you have more code in your procedure, it goes ahead and runs it. So that's how a for loop has to be set up. You have to give it a loop control variable, and you can declare it right inside there. Use a semicolon. The second thing that you tell it, the second parameter, is how many times you want it to go around, and that's determined by what you tell x to be. X can be less than or equal to 6. It can be greater than 6. You can do whatever you want. And then finally, the third part rather, is how am I going to increment x? Are we counting by ones, twos, or whatever? X plus plus is the same as x plus equals 1. This is very shorthand for this, and that's what everybody uses, so I would encourage you to do that. So that's how you count by 5s. Let's take an example of counting by 2s just to show you the difference. Here we're going to set up our loop control variable using an integer of x. I'm going to start at 2, and I'm going to keep going in this loop as long as x is less than or equal to 30. So you can see over here on the output, it started at 2 and it kept going as long as x was less than or equal to 30. X gets over 30, it's going to stop. Notice here that I've changed my counter in terms of incrementing x, and it now says x plus equals 2. And that means take x, add 2 to it, and that's the new value of x. Remember the x plus equals, the plus equals shorthand stuff that we've worked with before. That's how you do that. Again, 3 pieces of data are needed. You got to do them always in this order, and they're separated by semicolon. So all I'm doing, taking the value of x and pop it in the list box, and that's the result. Now let's do one more, counting backwards. If you want to count backwards, you just kind of flip things around. And here I want to start at 30. Okay, we're going to initialize x at 30, and that's why you see the 30 over here. We're going to keep going as long as x is greater than 0. So that means it's going to go till 1, right? And that's why at the bottom of the list box you see 1. So it started at 30, went all the way to 1, and it's counting backwards by doing x minus equals 1. So the first time x comes through here on this code, x is equal to 30. When it gets down here, it sets it to 29. And it comes back up here and says, should I keep going? Well, 29 is greater than 0, so I got to keep going. So it does it again. And it comes down here. Now x is 28. Should I keep going? Yes, 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 yes. When x becomes 0, it quits running. Okay, so you can count backwards by 5s, by 10s, by whatever you want, but that would be an example of how you would use a counted loop using a for loop structure. And remember, it's just for repeating a block of code, 1 line or 50 lines, whatever you have. but you only really use it when you know how many times you want to do something, or you can figure out how many times you want to do something. Now I want to stop this for a second. I want to show you an example of a project that actually uses this, because this will be a little more useful to you, and it'll make more sense. So let's take an example here with this little thing, using loops for C#. This is also in your 213 page. All right, let's take a look at how this works. First of all, what I have done here is that you can pick items from this left-hand list box, and when you highlight one and click this thing, it adds it over here to this other list box. So it's kind of like a shopping cart, okay? Something like that. And I only can pick one thing at a time. And please remember that when you have things in a list box, they're ordered by index numbers. That's why I put these numbers over here for you. Even though there's a total of 7 items right here, the biggest index number is 6, because we start counting from 0. All right, I'm going to say clear and that kind of thing too. Let me see how this thing works. We'll come in here. I'm going to close out these windows for you. Nothing particularly fancy about the using statements. I added items to the left-hand list box at runtime, so I created a form load event by double-clicking on the form, and I said on my list box called LST items, we're going to add items to the items collection using .items and then .add. We use the add method, and then in parentheses and in double quotes we add in what we want it to say. Notice I didn't worry about alphabetizing them or sorting them, because the list box itself has a property called sorted that we've used before, okay? And I can set that to true, or I can set that to false. Now, when we come down here, I want to cycle through the items and see which ones were selected. So let me show you how this works. If I pick this like this, if I hold down the control key, it lets me pick multiple items at the same time. Okay? The way I was doing it before, I just picked one at a time and popped it in there for you. But I want to show you a little trick here. If I pick that one, and let's say that one, and I hit this, it's going to take all of those and put them into this box. Now, it didn't do them one at a time. What it did was it used a loop. And it says, I'm going to cycle through all the items that were selected in this list box and pop them over here. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do this. Okay? Now, since we're doing this with a finite number of items, I wanted to use a for loop, because that's what we've been working on. The first thing I want to do is this. When they come in here and click the add button, which is what this little goober guy is here, this is the add button. When they click that guy, first of all, I want to make sure that they selected something, okay? Now, in the list box, let me go back here. When the list box is running, you can't see it, but when it's running like this and I'm selecting things, in the background it has a property that's called selected items with an S. Now, we've used selected item before when we worked with list boxes, but now you're looking at selected items. I went into the properties of the list box and I told it to use multi-selected as its selection mode, and that's why I can do this. In the background then, there's this collection of items that have already been selected. So Mr. Listbox already keeps track of this for us, which is very nice. So if I go back over here, I can have access to that when the program is running. If the number of items that were selected is greater than 0, that means they selected something. Then let's go ahead and add them to the cart. Otherwise, we're not going to do this. You get that from the selected items.count property. So that's very cool. So in your notes, when you have something you're working with for loops and working with list boxes, make a note to yourself that you can say the name of your list box.selecteditems.count will tell you how many items were picked. If they didn't pick any, there's no use continuing. But if it's greater than 0, then let's go through them. So here's what I want to do. I want to set up a for loop, and I'm going to use an integer called x, that's usual, and I'm going to set it to 0. Now, I'm setting it to 0, you guys, because the items in the list box are organized by index numbers starting at 0, and so I want to use that. I don't want to leave something out. And the items that are selected also start with 0. So check this out. You notice when we did the for loop before, I said run until x is less than 10 or less than 3 or less than 14 or something or greater than 2. Well, in this particular case, I have no idea how many items they're going to pick, right? Because they could pick one, they could pick all 7. But, but here's a nice thing about for loops. Remember I told you you're going to use it when you know how many times you want to do something, or you can figure out how many times you need to do something. And this is a case of the latter, because what I can do in this middle parameter, I can say I want you to keep doing this as long as x is less than the number of selected items. Okay, you see that? So the computer is going to tell me how many items they pick, so I can use that to control my loop. It's very handy. And then the next thing is, the next parameter is, we're going to do x plus plus, we're just going to count by 1. So here's how it works. You remember before in my demo, my other demo, that when I was running this loop, when I was saying like count to 5, I was taking whatever the value of x was and I was adding it to the list box. Okay? Well, I'm going to do the same thing here. It's just going to be more useful. In this particular case, we're going to use the list box on the right called LST purchase. So that's our little shopping cart. And we're going to say take the item from the selected items in the left-hand box and add them to the items in the right-hand box. That's what we're doing. But in order to keep track of the selected items, those are controlled by an index number. Well, I'm going to use my little loop control variable, x, here, and I'm also going to use him over here. Selected items as a collection, and a collection is a grouping of similar objects. And so in this case, when you're using a collection, you use these square braces. You use those in this and use them in a data array as well. So don't use the rounded ones, it won't work. So think of a grouping, a box of items you've stuck into a cup or a box, and you've numbered them all, starting from 0, and you just want to take them out one by one, 0, 1, 2, 3, until the cup is empty. That's what you're just trying to do. You're just taking things out of a bucket and counting them and until the bucket's empty. We're going to take this first item. Now, the first time the loop runs, x is going to be equal to 0. So we're going to go into the grouping of selected items, go into that bucket, and grab item 0. So that's going to be the first one, because listbox items are always stored with numbers starting from 0. And then what you have to do is, because these items look like text or string, but they're really not, you have to go ahead and convert those to string using the toString method. So you have to do that or it won't work. So do a dot toString, and don't forget your little rounded parentheses, because it won't put them in for you. Now it's going to take the first item, well, x is 0, let's just say they pick 3, and it's going to put them into the right hand box. Then it's going to go around here again, and now x is equal to 1. Remember I told you that's how it worked? So x is equal to 1, it's going to come up here to the for loop and see if it's supposed to do this again. This says keep going as long as the items count, number of items, is greater than x. So if x is less than the count, that means there's some left. So let's say we have 3 items, so the count is 3. Well, 1 is less than 3, so it's going to run again. So it's going to come down here, and it's going to grab the selected item number 1, because now x is 1. Pop it into the shopping cart, go again. Now x is 2. Comes up here. Is 2 less than 3? Yes, go again. So now it's going to take selected item with index 2 and pop it in there and keep going. As soon as x is greater than the number of items they picked, then it quits counting, and that seems perfectly logical. You can't be adding something to the cart when they didn't pick something. So even though you don't see it, I'm going to see if I can run this right here for you. This is the wrong one, isn't it? Yeah, I don't want that one. I want to see if I can run this right next to the code so we can kind of see what's happening here. I'm going to pick spark plugs and coolant. Hold down the control key and hit coolant. Now, when I hit this button, it's going to come in here and it's going to add those items very, very quickly. Now, since you can't see it do it, I'm going to slow this down. we're going to put a little breakpoint over here. I'm going to click over here on the left-hand side, way over here, and we're going to put a breakpoint. We're going to put our program into suspended animation here for a second so I can just show you how this works. I'm going to say OK, and we're going to come in here. Now the line that is evaluating this is yellow. That means it's ready to go when I want it to. So I'm going to push F8 on my keyboard, and I can step through my program one line at a time in order to see how the computer is processing my data. This is very, very handy when you're trying to find a problem. So now the first thing it does is we're going to set a new variable called x and set it to 0. So that's highlighted, so I'm going to make it do it. It just did it. And if I take my mouse and hover over x, it says x is 0. See that? Now we're going to go, now it's going to do the center part. It says x, keep going as long as x is less than the count. So I'm going to do that. Okay. Now you want to know what the count is? We can come up here, and I'm hovering over count with my mouse. See that? And look, it says over there, see in the box, selected items count equals 2. So you pick 2 items because I picked 2 items, remember? But the index numbers are going to be 0 and 1 because we start at 0. All right, so let's go down here. I'm going to push F8 again, and now we're going to take the first item and pop it into the right-hand box. X is 0. Okay, and we added it in there. Now it's going to go up here, and we're going to run it again, F8, and it's going to come up here, and it says, oh, I'm supposed to add x, add 1 to x, so we're going to go ahead and do that. Now x is equal to 1. Okay, and it says, am I supposed to keep going? Yep, I guess I am. 1 is less than 2, so I'm going to run it again, push F8, and now I come down here, and x is 1. Okay. Now I'm going to push F8 again. Come up here, it says add 1 to it. Push F8, and it says, x is, it went to a bigger number because it's done, but x exceeded the count. X got bigger than 2, and so it quit. And you see that it comes down here. That's the next thing it does. And if I push F5, it'll just keep running. So you can see how it put that in there. So that's a way to just step through these one statement at a time, and that's a very, very good debugging tool. And again, how you do it is you put your mouse, you got to make sure your program's not running. Put your mouse on one of these lines, and you can push F. It's not doing it. All right, go over here to the left side with your mouse. Earlier versions of it, you just use F9. I guess they took it out. So over here on the very, very left side, you put your mouse and you can put a breakpoint. You can put multiple breakpoints in. Okay, it doesn't care. And what it does is when you run your program, it's going to come down here and it's going to run until it gets to that breakpoint, and then it's going to pause. So your program is in suspended animation right now, and I can find out how many items are in the count of how many they picked, but you can see with the mouse over it, and it's showing it's 2. Okay, and then to run the next line of code, you push F8, push F8 again, and you can step through. This is called stepping through your code one line at a time so that you can see exactly what it's doing, because sometimes when you have a problem, it's not obvious, but it's jumping around and doing the wrong thing, or it's not getting the right data. This is really the only debugging tool that I use, you guys, and I wanted to make sure and show it to you. And when you're working with loops, that's the best time to learn how to do this, because it helps you see how the loop runs to begin with. Okay, so please read the section in your book on loops. Make sure you review the for loops. Make sure you download this project. Make sure you look at my loop control variable, or my loops demo rather, on your website, and let me know what questions you have and what things that we can explain maybe a little better. Now, these down here don't do anything other than I'm just clearing out the list box and quitting the application. So all the activity gets handled right here in these just little lines of code. So that's the way you have a little shopping cart.